Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for attending this webinar, Net Carbon Zero for our food system, the offer, the policy and the reality. We have some fantastic speakers who are going to provide presentations in the next few minutes that will cover the offer, the policy and the reality of reaching net carbon zero in food and beverage companies. It's a hot topic and many words for net carbon zero are being used, and we will clarify definitions and we will clarify how solutions can be implemented. And we're in a very good place to do that. Myself, I'm an associate professor at the National Centre for Food Manufacturing at the University of Lincoln. And we have three speakers today. The first speaker is Hugo Chambers from Sainsbury's, Sustainable Sourcing Manager. Hugo is well versed to deliver this talk because he's a one-step Green Ambassador for the up-and-coming COP26 meeting in the UK in Glasgow next month. So again, an extremely hot topic with net carbon zero, and often the food and beverage sector is overlooked in reaching net carbon zero. So Hugo is in the middle of implementing Scope 3 emission reduction programs in Sainsbury's, and a fantastic person to have on the webinar today. Then we will follow the talk with George Richards and Eleanor Kershaw from JRP Solutions, who are very much in the business of implementing net zero solutions and policies and frameworks in food business organizations. And as I've said, many of the issues that we're going to tackle is how do we actually implement these net zero applications in food and beverage companies. And much of our industry is made up of SMEs. Where do SMEs start in implementing net zero solutions? So an extremely hot topic, global reach, acting in all food businesses in the UK. The grocer, the industry media magazine earlier this year reported that at least a third of food and drink businesses have no climate targets. So where do we actually start in delivering net zero, for which our government has committed to by 2050? So without anything else to add at this stage, we will go through the talks, and then there should be at least 25-30 minutes for questions and answers. Please put questions and answers in the Q&A pop-up box. We will field those questions to our speakers, and you also have the opportunity to upvote questions, so the most popular questions can be asked. But all that's left for me to do at this stage is to hand over to Hugo to begin his talk, and thank you very much for attending today. Thank you, Hugo.
First, I'd just like to say thank you very much to Wayne, and hello to everyone, and thank you for having me today. I'm Hugo Chambers. I'm a sustainable sourcing manager at Sainsbury's. At Sainsbury's, I work within our environment team on two very close topics. One is focused on deforestation and how we tackle commodity-driven deforestation in our global supply chains. So in supply chains like palm oil or soy from South America. And I also focus on delivering our carbon targets, and particularly on how we deliver on our target to reduce our carbon emissions in our Scope 3 by 30% by 2030. And today, what I'm really hoping to give is an overview of what our carbon commitments are, what our journey essentially has been in setting those, and how we're thinking about those carbon targets, and particularly the one on our scope 3, which is essentially all the emissions associated to the products that we sell to our customers, and how our customers use those products. So first, if I start with giving you a bit of a sense of our science-based targets, we've long understood the impact of carbon emissions on our planet. So taking action on climate change and reducing our emissions has been a priority for us for a number of years. And in order to really effectively reduce our impact, we first had to fully understand our footprint across both our operations, which is known as our scopes 1 and 2, and our scope 3, which are associated, as I mentioned, to upstream activity, anything related to our supply chains, to primary production, agriculture, manufacturing, as well as downstream emissions, which are associated to how our customers use our products. At the beginning of this year, we were really pleased to have our scopes 1, 2, and 3 targets approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative, with our scopes 1 and 2 ambition, so for our own operations, to be net zero by no later than 2040. And that puts us on a 1.5 degree warming trajectory, which is in line with the highest ambition of the Paris Agreement. So that's for our scopes 1 and 2 and on our operations. And then secondly, we also published our scope 3 target, which is to see an absolute reduction of 30% in our scope 3 emissions by 2030. And today I want to talk to you a little bit more about this scope 3 target, what this means, and our plans to meet it. And the first thing I'd say is that it's really wide ranging. It covers emissions from fuel, from fresh foods, also meat, fish, and poultry, to produce, to the electronic products that we sell through Argos, for example. And we really need to focus where the majority of our emissions lie in our product supply chains, from raw material cultivation and extraction to manufacturing, to transportation, and to customer use. And by reducing the emissions associated to our products, our goal is very much to lower our impact and help customers lower theirs by offering them more sustainable products and helping them make better choices. And we know that this is something that's really increasingly important to them. So why set a scope 3 target, particularly if we already have a net zero by 2040 ambition for our own operations? Well, I mean, it really starts with looking at the numbers. If we look at the emissions associated to our business, over 95% of those emissions are generated in our supply chain. And as a top UK retailer, we can and we need to lead in driving lasting and positive change for our community. And we have, our position as a retailer gives us, the power and the opportunity to work with over 4,000 suppliers globally in the UK, but worldwide, and also have contact with over 28 million UK customers every year. And so really that's why we think we have to take responsibility for scope 3 emissions and work collaboratively with our suppliers and consumers to reduce those. So I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of how we're achieving those commitments. And we've developed a 3-stage approach to doing so. First, we need to understand our emissions. And I think that's one of the first challenges. And some of you who are joining us today, you may be thinking about your own science-based targets and carbon emissions reductions. The first challenge is really understanding where our emissions and the significance of those. And what we've done is we've identified the 30 sort of hotspot product groups, which constitute 80% of our emissions. And for these product groups, we're developing emissions map, each of which is unique, because reducing emissions within chicken will be very different to reducing emissions within a produce supply chain, for example. And it helps us identify where down those supply chains the emissions levels are highest, and where the possible intervention opportunities are to reduce them. So just to give you an example, in cheese, for example, over 70% of the carbon emissions are produced at farm level. So it's really critical that our direct cheese suppliers have their own Scope 3 plan with their suppliers. And in this case, that means working with the dairy farmers that they buy their milk from in order to drive meaningful reductions. And to understand our emissions, we need to continue to improve our data quality. I think that's one of the big challenges in addressing carbon reductions. And that means really working directly with our own key suppliers to help us refine our data sets and receive the necessary data from them to understand where the opportunities lie and where we can, and how our performance is tracking against our commitments. And next, we're really driving a roadmap to understand how to best sequence supplier engagement. I think, as I mentioned, we have over 4,000 suppliers, and we know that our suppliers will be at different stages of the journey. And so we want to ensure that we are, first of all, recognizing those that have shown leadership, and also support those that are starting on the journey. Because ultimately, we really want to be working with suppliers who share our ambition to mitigate climate change, irrespective of where they stand today. The second is around driving reductions. So we'll be asking our suppliers to have clear reductions targets and a roadmap to meet them. And for our strategic suppliers, that will go further and identify key initiatives we can work on together to decarbonize supply chains, from agriculture to mining to customer use. And it's really important that we support our commercial teams as well by embedded training, tools, and processes. And to that end, we're developing what we're calling, hotspot toolkits and deep dives for specific categories for them to really learn essentially where most of the emissions lies in a particular supply chain, and to develop a framework and scalable solutions that could be sort of utilized across our commercial functions. And then finally, it's really about measuring the impact and the progress. And in order to do that, we've requested that our key suppliers, around 400 of them this year, submit their emissions data through industry disclosures like CDP, which is mainly used for our food suppliers, and HIG for our non-food, so for general merchandising, for example. So, together those suppliers that we've asked to disclose through these through CDP and HIG, they represent around 90% of our Scope 3 emissions, and this will really inform the progress that we report on and help us understand where we have to prioritize action. And we're also developing tools to consolidate our reduction data into a format that it can be used both to measure performance within the business and to validate our SBTi commitments externally. So currently, we know that this is a challenge, this is challenging, and there's a range of different Scope 3 reporting mechanisms being used across the industry. And so we're also working with external groups such as RAP to push for the development of clear and standardized global reporting requirements on carbon. But hopefully, as you can see, we have a sort of very clear approach to addressing our Scope 3 emissions, but we still have a lot to achieve. And to further contextualize the challenge with Scope 3, I wanted to share two key pieces that we've understood in mapping our emissions. The first is that we know our suppliers, our direct suppliers, don't have complete control over our Scope 3 emissions. In fact, if we look at the data, most of our suppliers' emissions lie in their Scope 3. And so there's really, I think that what that makes clear is that there's a need to work across the entire value chain, from agriculture, manufacturing, and transport, to really be able to meaningfully reduce emissions and the carbon footprint of our products. The second, I think, piece that we've learned, and I think is really critical in how we think about the challenge of Scope 3 and carbon emissions of products, is the importance of land use. So in food, around, on average, 65% of emissions lie in agriculture or are generated through deforestation and what we call land use change. So ecosystem conversion, whether that's tropical forests or savannas like the Cerrado in Brazil, conversion from those natural ecosystems to farmland. And we know that agriculture is the main driver of deforestation and biodiversity decline globally. So we really have to work together as not simply as Sainsbury's, but as a wider industry to address the challenges linked to farming, to drive better farming practices, and set up data sharing systems that bring visibility right across the value chain. Because as you will see, it's not simply about our direct suppliers sharing information about their operations. It's about having a chain of information that goes right back to primary production. And really what this tells us is there's no pathway to net zero that doesn't include tackling the nature crisis. And I think that's one of the key learnings that we've had over the last couple of months. So we've started already on the journey, and we've made quite a lot of progress so far. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we've segmented suppliers according to their emission size, and we've asked a number of them to report through CDP and HIG, for example. We've detailed our footprint and identified emission product groups, hotspots in partnership, and we've done this in partnership with the Carbon Trust. And we've identified the 30 hotspot product groups that constitute 80% of our emissions, and we're focusing on those and understanding what are the levers that can be actioned across the value chain to reduce emissions. And for the identified hotspot, it's really about starting to engage our suppliers, our key suppliers, about what we can do together to action those levers. But there's clearly a lot more to do, and I think we recognize that from announcing our science-based targets earlier this year, we are very much on a journey as well, and there's still a lot more to do individually as a company, but collectively as an industry as well to address these different challenges. So where do we go from here? So we've made that progress, but as I mentioned, there is still that long journey ahead, and 2021 we see very much as a turning point for our Scope 3 efforts. So we've launched an initiative to accelerate our efforts so far. We're defining a clear strategy in our major product hotspots that we can then scale to the remaining hotspot categories. We're providing guidance and tools to suppliers to report their emissions, and we're embedding this work into our commercial team's discussions to ensure it gets implemented and it becomes, core to the way we do business. But we can't do this alone. As I mentioned, a lot of the challenges are industry-wide, and so we're working with multiple experts and advisors to support us in our transformation and drive change in the industry. And then, we're also really hugely excited to be a principal partner for COP26 in November, where we really hope to lead by example and mobilize the industry on Scope 3 emissions and carbon targets more widely. And really just finally, to give you a sense of our intent, our intent is very much to lead the industry on environmental impact. We've committed to transparent reporting. We've committed to enabling suppliers and customers to make more sustainable choices, because we think it's the right thing to do for our business, for our customers, and for the wider community. But it's very much based on this idea that we have to deliver better value for our consumers and our stakeholders. So that's hopefully an overview of how we're thinking about our carbon targets. I'll now hand back to George and Eleanor to give you a bit more of a sense of how they're thinking about the challenge as well.
Thank you, Hugo. I'll just share the screen. So Ellen and I are just going to go through a few slides. Very interesting points you made there, Hugo, and we'll try not to repeat some of the key messages that you gave there. I'm joined by my colleague Eleanor, who recently joined JRP. And for a little bit of background, we're working, I would say 80% of our current engagements with clients is all around net zero, primarily helping them to shape net zero strategies which are specific to their own organizations, and that goes across all sectors. But we've also done individual pieces of work around life cycle analysis as well for individual products and materials, etc. Excellent. So just a little bit about who we are. We've been around since 1999. Our historic business, if you like, or traditional business, was all around energy management, helping primarily industrial and commercial clients to manage their energy better, reduce consumption, reduce costs. We work across all sectors, and a few years ago we bought the Green Consultancy, so they're part of our group, who work primarily in the higher education sector. But about 3 or 4 years ago, we recognised the changing mood music, particularly emanating from the finance sector, who were making statements around choosing not to invest in non-sustainable businesses and organisations. So we began our own transition then to become a broader net zero business, with energy still very much at its heart, and began a process of recruiting and training and upskilling. And indeed, ourselves, we're committed to becoming net zero by 2030. We've applied to become a B Corp. We're already 50,001 certified. So in other words, we do what we're telling our clients to do. Next slide, please. That's great. And as a little bit of context, of course, we're all familiar with what's been going on in the wider world, but it really has accelerated the conversation. And certainly when you get statements from the likes of Mark Carney, who's an extremely credible person within finance sector and within world politics as well these days, making statements as he does, that not only is it the greatest commercial opportunity of his time, but I think around about the same time he made that statement, he also said in an interview on Radio 4 that any organisation or business that isn't sustainable won't be in business in 10 years' time. And then when you have business leaders such as Bernard Looney, which is quite a good name, I think, who obviously is chief exec of BP, who I worked for 20 years ago, recognises the need to change, and most certainly for an oil and gas company such as BPR, it's a massive challenge for them. Next slide, please. But what that's done is really resonate in boardrooms, and sort of we're pushing it at an open door these days rather than banging our head against a brick wall, which we've done for years and years. But just for a little bit of clarity, one of the questions we often get asked in early engagements with clients is, well, you know, what is net zero? You know, you also see statements around, oh, we're carbon neutral. What does that mean? Carbon neutral, in my view, is a modern day version of greenwashing. It often means that organizations have done a little bit around their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and then offset at the cheapest possible way they can the residual emissions. Well, that's not achieving net zero. It's not even a step towards it. We don't associate ourselves with that. But for clarity, net zero means all greenhouse gases, reducing all greenhouse gases, and we have to do that. We have to achieve that by 2050 by law in the UK. Other countries obviously declaring their own net zero targets. China, I believe, is 2060, but again, it will change in time. So that in the UK, all organisations have to achieve net zero by 2050. Obviously, other organisations, or some organisations, as Sainsbury's have chosen more ambitious targets, and that's brilliant. And we would encourage our clients to do the same where it's practical and possible. Next slide, please. So then we get into the areas of scopes, and this is where there's often a lot of misunderstanding. So this graph really does help to explain where your various greenhouse gases may be emitted, and they can be emitted in all three scopes. But as Hugo's already clearly shown, for an organisation like Sainsbury's, and they're definitely not on their own, a lot of the GHG impacts come within supply chains, in other words, in your scope 3 emissions. And that varies from organisation to organisation, but I think with every organisation we've engaged, the vast majority of their emissions are scope 3. So therefore, the importance of addressing scope 1, scope 2 is still there quite clearly, because it's within your direct control and influence, and it's also a much more visible thing, I guess. However, it would be foolish to ignore scope 3. And you can't, we would always say you can't do everything overnight. It's not a quantum leap solution. It's a step-by-step approach. So, and do you want to add anything to that, Eleanor?
No, I think that's fine.
Okay, next slide, please. So I'll give you a quick example of scope 1, scope 2. This is for a biscuit manufacturer. Next slide. We carried out an extensive energy audit on a site in Scotland, where they produced 40,000 tonnes of biscuits. It was very obvious the moment we set foot on site that energy wasn't a focal point for them. There was no accountability, no responsibility. There was a lack of processes, procedures, big holes in their data, which is always the starting point for us. And the result of the site energy audit obviously uncovered all those things, but also then identified over 80 improvement opportunities. And they weren't just, you know, the magic black boxes sitting in the corner doing magical things. This was about basic everyday processes and procedures. It was about seals on oven doors not being repaired. It was about things being left on when no product was coming down the line. And on this particular site, we took a video footage for about 3 minutes and showed it to a supply group of Marks and Spencer's. And in that, we asked them to spot as many improvement opportunities as they could. And the various groups came up with 10, 9, 11. They're all right, and they were also all wrong, because not one of those engineers in that room spotted the fact that there wasn't a single biscuit coming down that particular production line, not just for that 3 minutes, but for the entire shift. So that was delivering a very clear message that even those of us that think we know a lot often miss the obvious. But the upshot of that energy audit, and this is just talking about scope 1, scope 2, we weren't even looking at refrigerants or anything else, and we certainly weren't looking at their supply chain at that point. But the savings for them were huge. We could have reduced their energy consumption over a 5-year plan by 41%. And given the cost of energy at the time, and obviously it'd be an even stronger business case these days, we were talking about saving £820,000 a year in costs. If you relate that to the amount of biscuits they could have made or additional profit, it was very, very significant. And of course, more importantly, it would have generated CO2 reduction of 117,000 tonnes. So what happened? Nothing, because they had other priorities. Quite unbelievable, isn't it? But that is a story I could repeat to a greater or lesser degree. We went to another biscuit manufacturer not long after this, and it was a similar story, not quite as bad, but the same issues were there. And the moment that I remember going there and I set foot on site and we were giving me a guided tour, I walked into one production area, looked at the gas meter, which was sited at about 25 feet above an oven, covered in dust, pulse output not being picked up. So immediately that told me they had a big hole in their data, which said they had no focus and the data was unreliable. So that opportunity there was about 25% reduction in energy over a 3-year period. So the opportunities are still there. And if you're not focused on your scope 1 and scope 2, then you can imagine the opportunities that await in scope 3 is the key message I would suggest. Next slide, please. So yes, quite clearly, don't just focus on the tip of the iceberg, although that tip can produce some very positive results. The big beast lies beneath the waterline. And next slide, please. Eleanor, I'll hand over to you at this point.
Yeah, and although Joe just talked a lot about scope 1 and 2 there and some of these sort of almost horror story type examples, the scope 3 for as Hugo's already talked about, and as you can see from the slide here, is the bulk of most kind of manufacturing companies, certainly, but a lot of that scope 3 will be in the scope 1 and 2 of your suppliers. So asking those questions and developing a good relationship with them and bringing them along with you is important. I think for me, that's one of the biggest differences between the old attitude of carbon neutral or carbon offsetting potentially and net zero, is that net zero conceptually is a collective challenge. We all need to be on a journey together. We all need to be taking down the real emissions as quickly as we can, and then offsetting comes for just those residual emissions, the difficult things, the things which technologically we don't have an alternative for yet. So in scope 3, the scale of the challenge there, this is an example from a grower manufacturer that we're currently working with. So 82% of their emissions are in scope 3. That's the emissions from all their upstream and downstream, as Hugo's already described some of that. And as I say, for most companies, it's going to be over 75%. It quantifies really your share of the emissions released by all the other processes which feed into and out of your operations anywhere in the world, right from raw materials to end of life. And people say, well, we can't control it. Why should we be worried about it? Or rather, we should be worried about it, but there can be a little bit of sort of throwing hands up in the air and say, well, it's not our responsibility. But you can think about it in your boardrooms and in your conversations with colleagues about how it captures the emissions that are linked to your products, services and operations, that they wouldn't happen if you weren't operating. Yeah, you could say somebody else would be doing it. But if you were to divide up the share of all the emissions that are happening throughout your supply chain, saying, okay, whose behaviors, whose products, whose route to market is responsible for what? Scope 3 is the stuff that is attributed to you. So arguably, if you cease to exist, that should disappear. So that is something you should be trying to get under control by your conversations. Next slide, please. So yeah, the supply chain needs to move with you. It's got to be a conversation. It's got to be a collaboration. This is going into a bit more detail with the grower manufacturer that we're working with. And we've divided up. So Hugo talked a bit about separating out different divisions, different types of emissions. So they've done it in Sainsbury's based on produce type. We've done it with this client based on different aspects of their business, and some of it's very similar, but you can divide it up whichever way works based on how your company works, so that you can align it with the other conversations that you have, because that's the best thing to do. It's not just about aligning with your suppliers, it's also about aligning with the other conversations that you have going on internally. What are your priorities? We use a method, just so that you understand it a bit more. We use a method of, it's called an extended input-output lifecycle analysis. Basically, it examines all the suppliers based on their areas of business, and it uses standard DEFRA standard emissions factors. It calculates how much emissions are associated with each purchase that you make, sort of right through from post-production all the way through. So it gives you an industry standard estimate of your scope 3 emissions. So it means you don't need to go out to every single supplier and say, tell me your emissions, because this process can give you a good, well-informed estimate. You can then go out, and you would then in future stages go out and talk individually to your suppliers and say, tell me more about what you're doing, giving me more accurate data. And some of those, for say an individual supplier line, you might be able to bring down the numbers, just not because you've actually reduced it or they've reduced it, but because you have more accurate data. But until you've done a calculation based on the industry standard, you don't know where to focus your energies. And if we look there, you see the scope 1 and 2 are noted on there as well, and their proportions. And if you've already done a lot on your own scope 1 and 2, and you've identified, well, we could go the extra mile on some of those. If you look at it in the context of your whole emissions, you need to think about what's worth the investment, what's worth your energy and your time and your manpower to make it the biggest difference in your emissions. So that going the extra mile project that impacts your scope 1 could be a tiny invisible sliver on a pie diagram like this of your organization, where putting an equivalent amount of energy and effort and money into other kinds of intervention could be taking a much bigger slice out of another area of your emissions. The other thing that it shows you is that sometimes your highest financial value relationships might not represent your highest emissions. And so building your relationships, working together to reduce emissions is going to have the highest impacts. The one thing that I would always argue against is automatically thinking about changing suppliers. It should be a last resort, because if you stop working with them, somebody else will work with them. And we want everybody to be part of this moving together and bringing down the whole supply chain's impacts. That's the real difference, I think, for net zero conceptually, is that real sense of we're in it together and we're all working together to bring down the emissions. There are other conversations that are happening around costs. Just the last thing that I'm going to mention on it really is that carbon taxes. Mandatory carbon taxes have already been introduced for some of the highest impact industries. So currently that's mostly in energy and construction materials, but they are being passed on in costs to you already, whether you know it or not. But that's likely to be expanded to other industries in coming years. We already know that food waste is a big impact in carbon terms. So that's probably one of those that's fairly high up there. And the risk that you will have to pay through a levy if you don't invest to reduce the emissions through your supply chain, to a certain extent, you will end up paying for it one way or another. So it's worth doing what you can within your own control. And that gives you a better message to within your supply chain, to your direct customers, to the people you work with. If you're supplying into the likes of Sainsbury's and what have you, they'll be asking those questions. So my entreaty to all of you will be to welcome the questions, be part of the journey, see it as a positive. And that's all from me.
Thank you, Eleanor. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, George. And thank you, Hugo. Really fantastic. We do have a number of questions. And although I thought George and Eleanor really did define the scope 1, 2, 3 definitions exceptionally well, this question still seems to be asked. Could you, in a nutshell, and this is on this question specifically to George and Eleanor, could you, in a nutshell, define 1, 2, and 3, what it is?
Sure. So scope 1 is all of the direct emissions from your operations. So that's any fuel that you burn on site, any heat that you produce on site. So if you are a manufacturer, it will be everything. If you think of it like a car, it's everything that comes out of the engine, out the tailpipe, directly on your site. So everything which is direct from something which you own, and that would include vehicles that you own. So if you own your own fleet, that's in your scope 1. If you have staff members who own their own vehicles, who drive company vehicles rather, that's in your scope 1. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from energy. So primarily it's from electricity. So that's basically accounted per kilowatt hour in crude terms, the amount of emissions resulting from the electricity that you use. There are a few other small categories, but that will be the main bulk of it. And then scope 3 is everything else. All the indirect emissions that are happening off-site, in other people's operations, all the released by processes which feed into and out of your operations anywhere in the world, from raw materials to end-of-life disposal, that you haven't directly emitted or via your electricity, is your scope 3.
Okay, that's fantastic. Hopefully that clarifies. Sorry?
Just to add to that, Wayne, one of the biggest challenges facing manufacturers of anything, not just in the food industry, but where they're using heat in the process. So you take the biscuit manufacturers example. The biggest challenge to achieve net zero is the decarbonisation of that heat.
Yeah.
That's the biggest challenge.
We'll certainly come on to that in a bit. I've got another question around that. But
one other to mention, so I just thought of it, particularly relevant for food, is refrigeration, because that's a massive area. And direct emissions of refrigerant gases is, so if you remember the diagram that George shared, those little clouds with different chemical symbols on them, quite a few of those are refrigerants. So anything, all refrigeration facilities will have a certain amount of what's called fugitive emissions. So things that escape, that's counted in your scope 1. And then you'll have a big chunk, if you have a lot of refrigeration, in your scope 3, which is the people who look after your refrigeration equipment, who supply it, and the production and associated emissions around those gases.
Thank you. That leads me to the next question from our attendees, and that will go specifically to you, Hugo, because I think you also mentioned this in your presentation. You have 4,000 suppliers. What can we do to support suppliers? Because Eleanor has almost given this what I'd call a Russian doll type of thing on responsibility and custody. Who owns that responsibility, and how do you deal with that with 4,000 suppliers, which is in some ways a relatively small chunk of the whole food system in the UK, because the FSA tell me there are 350,000 food businesses out there. So 4,000 is big and complex. How are you going to deal with that?
I mean, that's absolutely clearly one of the challenges, but also, you know, the opportunities of driving scope 3 reductions. I think first, and you know, I mentioned this earlier, I think that our approach is first to I suppose prioritize and identify from those top suppliers, and you know, if there are any manufacturers in the audience that have their own suppliers, you know, I think that is relevant to them as well. You first have to start with the mapping of your emissions, and that doesn't only mean the emissions by product category, it also means emissions by suppliers. And actually, although we have 4,000 suppliers, if you look at our food business, the top 230, 240 suppliers are associated with 90% of our scope 3 emissions. So immediately, you know, we're looking at a much smaller group of companies that we want to really prioritize when we're driving action. But that doesn't mean that actually the what is left and the long tail isn't important, because I think emissions across, I think reductions across the entire industry are really what's needed if we're going to, you know, meet the Paris Agreement. And I think what we can do as Sainsbury's is first try and set a clear timeline and target. So, you know, we have aligned to particular, so if for scope 3, for example, to reducing our scope 3 emissions by 30% by 2030 in absolute terms. We're not talking about offsets here, it's absolute reductions like Eleanor and George were mentioning. And we're going to be asking our suppliers to set their own targets. And I think that will essentially, for those that are at the beginning of their journey, setting their own targets and going about doing that, I think is really the first step in understanding where the emissions lie, what can be done to reduce in our own operations versus scope 3. And having that clear ask, I think, for suppliers that they share our ambition, irrespective of where they stand, I think is really important. And then thirdly, there's also a piece around we have to be catalysts for learnings, because we have almost a privileged position at the end of the supply chain. We source tens of thousands of different products, you know, from toothbrushes from China to coffee from Kenya. And dependent on the sector, there will be loads of different learnings and progress being made. And what we can do, and we started doing that through our supplier website called Together With, is share some of that guidance, some of that information for those suppliers who are at the beginning of the journey. So we can essentially identify what best in class looks like, you know, what the best suppliers are doing, and some of them will have progressed much more than we have, and actually share it with the rest of our supply base and say, you know, these are the resources that can help guide you in your journey.
Okay, that's fantastic. We have another question that's pretty much an open question to all three of you, and that's the role of data transfer, and in particular labeling. What is there a role for labeling in this? I mean, is there a role for another certification on the label, as it were? And that will also, there's been a question from our audience that this will engage informed consumers, informed consumer choice. But is there any value in thinking about labeling, such as the food hygiene rating system, for example? I think there are some schemes out there that have implemented environmental labeling for a start, but what is the role of labeling in this arena?
So I could share a little bit about Sainsbury's and our thinking around this. I think, you know, we see absolutely as a role for better information on particular products being shared with customers. And I think we're working collaboratively with a number of different industry groups to identify, you know, what is the best, you know, system in developing, because any system has to be built collaboratively, because, you know, I think the main risk is that, you know, one supplier, obviously we can have one supplier use one particular eco-labeling system and another use a different one. Things have to be based on a common framework, a common system, a common set of KPIs. And I think I think that's part of the responsibility we see as having is taking part in those conversations and understanding what that eco labeling could look like. And you know, there are some that, for example, would just use an eco score, say of 1 to 5, for example, that captures every environmental issue. So you'd have carbon, water, deforestation, perhaps packaging, plastics, and then you'll have others that are a little bit like nutritional, you know, red, green label product ratings that detail the performance across different environmental issues. And I think what we're trying to do is work through, you know, what works best for customers. And I think I'm sure Eleanor and George have some comments on this as well. But I think one particular challenge in developing this is how good is the data that backs this. I think that's the main challenge. If for example, we're selling take the coffee example, a coffee from Kenya or a coffee from Costa Rica, And if we're developing an eco label on products, do we know what the, do we have the primary data from the farms in Kenya? Do we have the primary data from the farms in Costa Rica to understand really what their farming practices is? Because actually, if you look at coffee, shipping will be important, but farming is the main driver. So I think that the availability and the quality of the data is the main challenge. And I think where industry has to come together is developing those systems to capture this information, but also where information isn't possible, align behind the best possible estimates.
Thank you, Hugo. On that point of data, George and Eleanor, it's been mentioned today. How do you, I mean, interoperability, i.e. getting the data in a standard format so that it can be used by suppliers downstream, upstream in supply chain is a generic problem that we're all dealing with in the food system. So, I mean, how do you, when you go into companies and you're facing these energy mismanagement, losses of efficiency and so on, how do you tackle that to get a standard interoperability between suppliers and operators in a particular business, for example?
I can talk about the process that we go through to acquire the data that's available. You can only work with what's available. So if you think about on scope 1, scope 2, that's probably the easiest bit, because even if the detailed information isn't readily available, we can directly engage with their suppliers and access portals to get that data. So that's the relatively easy bit. And plus submitted data where it's available, and where it's not, then that would be one of the recommendations, is to put that in. When it comes to the supply chain, part of the process is we do a expenditure-based analysis of their supply chain to help identify, and also do some desk-based research to identify the biggest emitters within that supply chain. And one of the things that we always look at as well is we do a governance review. So we look at current practices and policies, so things like the procurement policy, and also some of the supply contracts with their key suppliers, or with at least the biggest emitters within that supply chain, and suggest changes to that. So initial engagement by asking the right questions. I think quite often the question isn't even being asked of suppliers. So if you ask your supply chain for some carbon data, you might be surprised that many of them will already have it, or at least some of them will. You can probably second guess where the difficulties are going to arise purely by the location of some of those suppliers. And then that sets you a different challenge, I guess, in terms of how you then engage those suppliers to encourage them to provide that information to you within a given time frame. And I guess at some future point, there may come a point where you have to make a decision: do you continue with that supplier, or start looking for an alternative that can give you the information you need?
I think the bridging thing between the two aspects that George and Hugo have talked about is about the usefulness of data, because data becomes, like raw data, no matter what metrics you're using, becomes proportionately less useful the further away you are from the source. So Hugo doesn't want to see the raw data of a supplier. We want to work with them for them to understand it, to work out what they're going to do about it. And that's where there needs to be this collective development of shared metrics, which are meaningful across the board, whether that is emissions per kilo of product or something. That we have to work out collectively what the right KPIs are for being able to have these conversations and move into more, I suppose I'd use the phrase, probably radical transparency. We need to be comfortable across the whole supply chain of having these conversations and saying we're on a journey together, and people won't want to talk about those numbers very readily.
There are a number of questions that can develop this. And the first part is probably yours, Hugo, but do you think consumers are responding to carbon zero messaging currently? Do you think there's resonance there in food and beverage consumers?
I think there's still, I think the short answer is somewhat, but it's clearly increasing. And it's clearly, I think when we've done, analysis and seen data and surveys on the understanding of customers and its relation to the climate change, for example, I think there's growing awareness of customers and between the link of food and the products that they buy and the impact that it may have on climate. I think there's not necessarily as much, I think, and that's frankly just because the data and I think the information isn't there. And I think that that's absolutely for the industry to make that more available. But there's not yet the information that allows people to judge, what is better or worse. We know that, for example, red meat, is worse than chicken somewhat, but there's no sense of scale in that. And I think that kind of information is I think still needs to be driven. And I think as a retailer, if you look at some of our latest ad campaigns, for example, it's very much focused on helping everyone eat better. So that's eating better products for you, but also eating better products for the planet.
This is leading to some really interesting points, and we're going to have to finish. But as myself as a consumer, us as consumers, how do we trust science-based targets? I mean, Eleanor mentioned extended input-output LCAs. I'm not going to put that in front of the consumer. How do we trust these? I mean, science-based targets are absolutely essential, but how do we actually trust them? Is there anything in place to instill that trust?
Sorry, go ahead,
Karen, Hugo.
No, please go ahead.
I think it's the same answer to that as to the question around labeling, to be honest. Is that we have to, in terms of when we develop our communication strategies, understand what do people want to know, what are they able to take on board, and how much of it are they going to be paying attention to at the point where they're making the decisions. And those questions need to be asked first before we decide what we want to talk about. And developing behaviour change strategies is something that we do with a number of our clients, and Hugo will be very much involved with that. And it is about being credible. And we have to really watch out for the pitfall trap of simplifying things to a point where we think people can understand them, but almost oversimplifying them to the point where they become untrue because you scratch the surface and you can see that it's too simplified. And I think people are becoming much more savvy about questioning what does that mean. And sometimes we can say something in a simple way where it can seem untrue, and it's not. It's just a question of simplification. So that's
on the point of simplification to everyone. What I'd like to do is just finish on this idea: is offsetting still important, or is it an opt-out? Will it still be important? And that's really the last question that we can ask.
I think from a Sainsbury's perspective, our focus on meeting our climate targets is to rely primarily on and heavily on absolute reductions in emissions. There is a very small, and I'll just finish on this piece, but if you look at the SBTi's net zero target standard that they will publish next year, if you look at how we reach net zero across our entire, scopes 1, 2, and 3, the target is 90% reduction in absolute emissions, and then there's an allowance for 10% that can be covered by offsets. So it really tells you that the main focus is absolute reductions and not offsets.
Do you want to add anything to that, George and Eleanor, quickly?
Well, for us, the offsetting or insetting, which is obviously a different approach, has a role to play whilst there are still gaps in the technology that's available to achieve net zero. And it's a choice for organisations. And I'd say that just be transparent about what you're doing and be credible in what you're doing. So if you choose to go down the offsetting route, so you want to make specific declarations, or you want to add value in the local community, however you're going to inset or offset, absolutely great, but the focus has to be on reducing your absolute emissions. That has to be number one.
Okay, well,
yeah. Just very briefly on insetting, just so people understand what that is. So insetting is effectively a form of offsetting, but within your own supply chain. So this ties back to that supply chain engagement. So there might be aspects of your supply chain you identify that there's no way it can reduce on its own, and making investments to make that happen could be part of your journey. But absolutely, it should be for the residuals, for the things that you can't clear out by any other method.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Eleanor. All that remains for me to do is to thank George, Eleanor, and Hugo for fantastic presentations. I hope I've done justice in asking the questions that were put forward by the attendees, and I hope I've done justice to the presentations that you presented, because I really do think we have clarified some of the jargon, some of the vocabulary around carbon zero, and we've seen some fantastic examples, both from JRP Solutions and Sainsbury's today. So thank you very much from the IFST and the Sustainability Group at the IFST. Thank you for attending, people today. Some great questions. I probably couldn't get round to them all. I apologise for that, but hopefully we've done justice to defining what carbon zero offers, the policy and the standards around it, and also the opportunity and the reality of implementing solutions here. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you, speakers.
No problem. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you all.